What's up, heathens?
How y'all doing?
I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Evan Wilkerson and his take on the Christian evidence for the historicity of Jesus. I kind of figured that we've been focusing on the non-Christian evidence for Jesus lately. It's time to remind ourselves how poor the Christian evidence is for the historicity of Jesus. So if y'all want to fuck around and find out how bad the historical evidence for Jesus is, then please stay tuned.
Chances are you've heard this claim that Jesus never existed, that he wasn't a real historic figure. But did you know when it comes to the experts in their field, the scholars and the historians, whether they're agnostic or atheist or Christian, there's almost universal agreement among them that Jesus certainly existed. This is because there's overwhelming evidence for Jesus' existence.
This is technically not true. It's not because there's overwhelming evidence. It's because the scholars in relevant fields for this particular question are primarily Christian and are mostly controlled by statements of faith. In David Fitzgerald's most recent book, Jesus, Mything in Action, he lays out a pretty rock-solid case for exactly how many of these degree-granting institutions that are relevant to this particular question are controlled by statements of faith. A good number of them just simply refuse to even take part in the study because they were controlled by statements of faith. In the book, David shows how even prestigious universities like Harvard would reject somebody for a professorship just because they didn't toe the Christian line. So this is an issue that permeates New Testament studies in general. And Christian apologists like Evan here want to make it out to be like it's primarily historians that are tackling this particular topic, but really it's New Testament scholars. They are sort of tangentially related to historical studies, but they themselves are not historians. That's not to say that their degree in New Testament studies isn't relevant to this question. It totally is. Another thing is that they always like to bring up agnostic and atheist scholars that agree that Jesus existed. While I do agree that New Testament studies and historians do have some agnostic and atheist scholars that agree that Jesus existed, the number of scholars that agree with mythicism or are agnostic on this idea that Jesus existed in history is growing. But if you were to take away the atheist and agnostic scholars from this pool of scholars he's talking about, the vast majority, overwhelmingly so, are Christian scholars that are controlled by statements of faith. So when he says that the evidence overwhelmingly supports that Jesus existed in history, this is evidence that's put forward by Christian scholars controlled by statements of faith, and that as a vast majority of New Testament scholarship controls the rest of New Testament scholarship. Just listen to John W. Loftus talking about why he held back his opinion on this particular subject for so long.
Now, to do my job effectively as a debunker, I can't be seen as a crank. That was my modus operandi. I didn't want to be seen as a crank to those I wanted to reach. I must meet them on some common ground, the believers, the Christians. To come out as a mythicist early on would have been counterproductive, I think, for two reasons. One, because they think that's a crank position, and two, things have not progressed with mythicist studies as far as they have to this day. Well, now that I've established myself enough that Christians don't take me as a crank, I am at the position in my life saying what I think. And that just recently actually dawned on me. At what point can we say all traces of any real Jesus are gone, and that they're gone because he never existed as a real person in the first place? We have to work with what we have, not what we hope will be discovered in the future. So what do we have? And what can we conclude now? We can conclude that whatever traces of a human being we might find behind the ancient tales of Jesus, at best, they are indistinguishable from him not existing at all.
The fear of backlash in the New Testament scholarly community is so great that it even affects atheist and agnostic scholars. So no, I don't think that there's a vast amount of evidence that supports his existence. I think that there's just a vast number of Christians that don't even want to discuss this subject.
Now the question is, does it matter if our sources for Jesus are Christian or non-Christian? I had a high school student ask me once, are there any sources for Jesus outside of the Bible? I replied, why do they have to be outside of the Bible? And while she didn't have a response, I think I can take a guess. It's because skeptics don't trust the Bible. So of course they want their sources for Jesus to be outside of Scripture.
Well, yes, that would be nice, because obviously any book that's contained within the collection of books known as the Bible, they would have a bias. But that doesn't preclude them from being a good reference for a historical Jesus. Like, for instance, I think that the only author in the Bible that we can really use in this particular context is Paul. The Gospels come much later and are based on the teachings of Paul, as well as Christians that existed well before the Gospels were written down. If by the Bible you mean the Gospels, then yes, we can't trust those. But if you want to take the books of the Bible individually and use just the authentic letters of Paul, then we can build a picture of what these first Jewish Christians were like. Personally, I find Paul to be the best hope for a historical Jesus that historicists have. But the problem is, I think that the arguments for Paul considering Jesus to only ever be celestial are vastly stronger than the arguments for Paul saying that Jesus existed historically on earth.
And before we step into that territory of using non-Christian sources to prove Jesus, I first want to show in this video that the Gospels and other Christian writings are reliable historical documents to prove Jesus' existence.
Oh, awesome. I'm glad that you're going to try to establish them as reliable historical documents. I really don't think that you can include all the Gospels in this, because obviously all the Gospels aren't reliable historical documents. I think the best that you could probably say is that Mark is the closest thing to history, even though it still has a lot of magical elements to it. This isn't all that different from other historians at the time that were writing down things. I mean, you've got various authors reporting very magical things, and they were non-Christian historians that were actually keeping track of history rather than writing this theological narrative about Jesus. But my point is that you could definitely use Mark in order to try and build a case that they're at least based on some kind of historical story or historical tradition about Jesus. So, I mean, I'm willing to go that far for the sake of this particular argument. I don't think that that's the route he's going to take, but let's see what he does with the Gospels.
So first we have the Gospels. These are eyewitness testimonies of Jesus' life, proving that he existed.
Right off the bat here, I mean, you're just blowing shit out your ass, because the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts, and no reasonable scholar with a relevant degree in this particular context is going to say that they are eyewitness accounts. They're very obviously not eyewitness accounts. And there's various ways that you can know that they're not eyewitness accounts. For one thing, the authors of these Gospels, which are not the titled authors, but we'll get to that in a minute. The authors of these books, they don't take active roles within their narratives. And this is very different from how historians wrote at the time, or how eyewitness testimonies were taken or given at the time. So to say that these Gospels are eyewitness accounts really ignores how people wrote about eyewitness accounts at the time. Another big difference is that there's no sources cited. Like, not even within the Gospels themselves do they say, this is the person that I got this story from. They're all very ambiguous, and they're told as theological narratives, not history. Another thing is that the only source that they ever cite are the scriptures. And if you're only going to cite scriptures, then it kind of seems like the later Harry Potter novels citing something that happened in the first Harry Potter novel. So it really doesn't prove that these things actually happened. It just proves that they used the Old Testament in order to generate these gospel stories.
Now, eyewitness testimony is a powerful thing. Just one eyewitness testimony today could put a criminal behind bars for life.
What crime shows are you watching exactly? Because that's not how our justice system works. Even if you have an eyewitness that says, oh, this person did that thing, if you don't have corroborating evidence that makes sense with that person's testimony, then it's highly unlikely that that person's telling the truth. So it kind of seems to me like you can't convict somebody just based on one person's eyewitness testimony. Because if we have other evidence, hard physical evidence that contradicts that testimony, then you're not going to be taken seriously. Like the jury in that situation is going to think that you're lying about it and is not going to consider your testimony the end all be all. So, and this relates to how we take history as well, because while in history we do give a little bit more leniency to eyewitness testimony, the problem is that the fact that the Gospels don't relay anything that seems to be connected to history and just seems to be a theological narrative that's a euhemerization of this celestial figure, I think that the evidence surrounding it seems to refute it.
And in the case with the Gospels, we have 4 eyewitness accounts for the life of Jesus. Matthew and John were personal disciples of Jesus, having been with Jesus the full 3 years of his ministry.
This is kind of funny because, like I said before, the Gospels don't name their authors within them. He's taking the people mentioned in the titles as being the authors of the Gospels. And this is due to Papias, who was identifying these Gospels by name of the people that authored them. But the problem is that the titles were tacked on much later than they were written. And Papias isn't exactly a very well-trusted source. He's got various other things that have been refuted that he has said to have been true. And he gets all of this by way of a third party named the Elder John. And this is a person that doesn't appear anywhere else. And it just seems like Papias made this person up in order to give some kind of authority to the information that he was bringing. But in any case, it seems like Papias is the reason why people think that the titled people are the authors of each book, but they're not. Back to what he was saying, that Matthew and John are direct disciples of Jesus. Paul never mentions anybody being a direct disciple of Jesus, so it kind of seems hard for me to believe that these people were disciples of Jesus when they don't give us any kind of indication that they were. If they were eyewitnesses or disciples of Jesus, then they wouldn't have needed to copy off of Mark's gospel in order to generate their gospels. They would have had their own particular way of writing about the same stuff. They wouldn't have just copied from a previous work. Another thing is that the Gospel of John does not denote the Apostle John as being the author of that particular gospel. At the very end of the Gospel of John, it talks about the beloved disciple being the author or the source for the Gospel of John. And as far as scholars can tell with that particular gospel, that beloved disciple is Lazarus, not John. So Evan here seems to just be out of date with the scholarship, even though he's saying that all the scholars agree on these particular things. Or at least he's implying that he's getting his information from the scholarship. It seems like what scholarship he's reading are just conservative Christian scholars who are most likely controlled by statements of faith and are required to consider Jesus to not only be historical, but to have magically risen from the dead.
Then you have Mark, who recorded the eyewitness testimony of Peter, someone who was on the in crowd of Jesus' life.
I have no idea where he gets this kind of information from. It's just sort of generally known. I think probably Papias is the one that specifies that Mark recorded Peter's teachings about it. The fact is that when we look at Mark's gospel, we don't get any kind of indication that Peter is the source for the information contained within Mark, or that even John Mark was the author of the Markan gospel. This is just freshly pulled out of somebody's ass and is not actually rooted in evidence.
Then you have Luke, who said he carefully examined multiple eyewitnesses so that you could read the account of Jesus' life with certainty.
Well, Luke does start off his gospel saying that, and Luke's gospel is the one that closest resembles historians' writing at the time. It seems to me like Luke only half-assed does this, because the introduction to Luke's gospel is incredibly short. And that's very unlike historians at the time that would have discussed sources as well as methodology for resolving contradictions. We don't find any of this in Luke's gospel. I could painstakingly go through and show how Luke's gospel is not a historical account, but I already have a video clip of that on my other channel, Godless Engineer Shorts. Matthew Ferguson lays out an extensive list of the reasons why the gospels, especially Luke, deviate from actual historical accounts. Reasons like the lack of internally analyzing and addressing the contradictions in the traditions, the presence of the author in the work, the education level of the target audience, genre differences, authorial speculation, a lesser degree of authorial license, interdependence between the Gospels, miracles are central to the story instead of at the fringe, and important events and people just immediately disappear from the narrative. All of these reasons lead us to conclude that Luke is writing theology and not history. Definitely go and check that out, but there are just several ways in which we can know that the Luke Gospel is not a historical account. This is definitely theology.
There were early Christians that had known Jesus or knew the disciples and that they had been with Jesus. They accepted these testimonies as trustworthy information about Jesus because it came from Jesus' closest followers.
This is just simply not true. Like I said before, Paul doesn't indicate anybody as knowing Jesus while he was on earth or that Jesus was on earth at all. Paul never specifies anybody as being a disciple or walking and talking with Jesus. He only identifies people as apostles, and apostles are those that receive visions of Jesus. Now, a lot of Christian apologists like to say that that's not the full definition of what an apostle is. An apostle is somebody that walked and talked to Jesus, but also had visions of him after his resurrection. And that's simply not what Paul tells us an apostle is in the context of Christianity. So they're literally having to tack on information to what Paul tells us about apostles. Not only that, but they're also having to use information later stated about the apostles. And that's something that you just can't do in history. So no, none of this information came from anybody that knew Jesus. And there was no historical investigation done by the earliest Christian scholars, which I think he's about to bring up. So I'll get to that here in a second.
In other words, if Jesus never existed, then there wouldn't have been any early Christians, and there certainly wouldn't have been any acceptance of these 4 biographies of a man who never lived.
I sincerely doubt this particular statement because all that is required is a belief in Jesus in order to explain how Christianity arose. It does not take a physical representation of Jesus or for any of the events of the Gospels to have happened in order for Christianity to come about. Jewish theology denotes that a Messiah would come, and it's true that there were some sects of Jews in the first century that expected a military Messiah, a Messiah to come in and kick ass and take names. That would be messiahs like the Egyptian, as recorded by Josephus. The Egyptian amassed an army of people and tried to take over Jerusalem, but he ended up failing. All of his disciples, his entire army was killed, and he escaped. It's obvious that there were some Jews at the time that were expecting a military Messiah. But as Paul shows, there were also some people that were only ever expecting a celestial Messiah to have a victory over the spiritual oppressor of the world. That would be Satan. And that's what Paul's Jesus ends up accomplishing, not on the earthly realm, but in the celestial realm. And all it takes is a mere belief that that was accomplished in order for Christianity to become popular.
In other words, the Gospels never would have survived out of the first century.
How exactly does this track? I don't understand how, if Jesus was only ever celestial, that means that the Gospels wouldn't have survived. I think that the Gospels come so much later that nobody could verify the historical accuracy of the Gospels and that they just took them at their word. Considering the fact that the Christian religion was originally a mystery cult, the public stories told about Jesus were made to seem very earthly. The internal understanding of the theology has Jesus in a celestial realm. It's clearly seen in Paul's writings that the scriptures are the only evidence that Jesus ever did anything.
Then you have the apostles' confirmation. Take, for example, the Apostle Paul. He has the earliest written letters about Jesus and Christianity. And this is great because the earlier a document is, the more valuable and historically certain it is. Scholars date his first letter to the Corinthians back to about AD 55, just 25 years after Jesus' death. But what's really fascinating is that within this letter, chapter 15, we see signs that Paul was using and incorporating a Christian creed, and that this was recited among followers. We know this because he says, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures."
Yes, according to the scriptures. Paul is citing that the scriptures are the only way that he knows that this happened. A lot of apologists like to say that this is a creed that he got from other Christians that existed before him. But what he's technically saying here is that he has received this from Jesus or from the scriptures. Those are the only ways that Paul knows anything about Jesus. So how does he know that Jesus died? Well, the scriptures say so, and also that my vision of Jesus said so. How do we know that he rose on the third day? Well, that's because the scriptures say so, but also the visions of Jesus that I've had have said so as well. Those are the only ways that he knows these things. And regardless of where Paul may have gotten this creed from, the fact that it says the scriptures are where we got this information totally rule it out as being a historical reference to Jesus. How can he not read the literal words on the screen? He read them, but he's totally ignoring the fact that it says, according to the scriptures.
So right here, Paul says, I've received this creed and I've passed it on to you. Historians say this creed likely dates back to only 4 to 6 years after Jesus' death, meaning we have the earliest, most valuable confession that not only did Jesus exist, but of who he was and what Christians believed about him.
Am I reading the same fucking passage as Evan here? Because that's not what I heard. What I heard was, I am passing on to you what I have received as first importance. How did he receive information? Well, he got visions from Jesus and he read the scriptures. So it seems to me like Paul is not saying that other Christians gave this to him, but that he only knows this information is true because the Lord or Jesus is the one that confirmed these things. But also, the scriptures told him these fucking things. It's not that they are historically true. It's that they are in line with what the scriptures say. This feels like a total mindfuck every time I hear a Christian apologist say this, because it's literally not what Paul says.
Then you have the Apostolic Fathers' confirmation of this message. Now, who were the Apostolic Fathers? Well, they were students of the apostles. So take, for example, the Apostle John. He had 3 students in the latest years of his life, Papias, Polycarp, and Ignatius. These students carefully wrote down the teachings of John, again, someone who was an eyewitness to Jesus, and they constantly reaffirmed this message that Jesus existed. And then, of course, these students had other students of their own. Take, for example, Irenaeus. So 1 century after another, we have this secured transferring of eyewitness testimonies about Jesus.
Well, no, this is not true at all. In fact, Irenaeus is the one that has identified these previous people as being disciples of John. These previous people that he mentioned are not the ones that state that they were disciples of the Apostle John. This is just some fuck a couple lifetimes after the supposed apostle lived, claiming that this apostle had disciples. I mean, I don't understand why people take what Irenaeus says about these people as being like the quote-unquote gospel truth. If these people were direct disciples of the Apostle John, then they should have said it, but they don't. They don't ever give any kind of indication that they were disciples of the Apostle John. Also, the fact that John was most likely written in the 2nd century and not by the Apostle John. Even the Gospel of John doesn't claim that the Apostle John wrote the Gospel of John. It was actually Lazarus, as we laid out before. But these are really poor examples of early church fathers that historically investigated the faith. Because, in fact, no early church father historically investigated the faith. Better representations would have been Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, Aristides, and Tatian. Let's just take Justin Martyr, for example. He did no historical investigation whatsoever. In fact, he asserts the exact opposite of historical research. If we look at Justin Martyr's apology, he'll tell us exactly where this information came from. So, in these books of the prophets, we found Jesus, our Christ, foretold as coming, born of a virgin, growing up to man's estate, and healing every disease and every sickness, and raising the dead, and being hated, and unrecognized, and crucified, and dying, and rising again, and ascending into heaven, and both being and being called the Son of God. Justin Martyr, Apology 131. So basically right here, Justin Martyr reaffirms exactly what Paul said, in that all of this information is only ever found in the scriptures. And that is the only reason why Justin is convinced about Jesus and his story. Richard Carrier in Not the Impossible Faith summarizes what convinced Justin Martyr about the veracity of Christianity, and it's not the fact that he historically investigated shit. Justin is telling us he chose Christianity because it was the only philosophy that placed God first, taught its doctrines for free, and didn't require any research or advanced study. He adds, as the final blow that converted him, the fact that Christianity was based on the oldest and thus most venerable of prophetic books. Richard Carrier, Not the Impossible Faith, summarizing the dialogue of Justin and Trypho, sections 3 through 8 and 7 through 8. So as we can see, the most educated Christian scholars past the time when any disciple or any apostle would have been alive did not historically investigate anything about the Christian religion. And this goes for all 4 of those educated Christian scholars that I listed. So no, nobody historically investigated the claims about Christianity, not even the most educated Christian scholars in the 2nd century.
These authors wrote of Jesus, proving that he existed, but also validated the writings of Gospels and the rest of the New Testament, showing that they are trustworthy documents.
But they don't. They don't show that they're trustworthy documents. In fact, the documents themselves refute the idea that they are trustworthy. The Gospels copy off of one another in order to build this story about Jesus. Mark being the first gospel, with the other gospels copying off of Mark either directly or indirectly. And you can't even save yourself with the Gospel of John, because John definitely knew all 3 of the other gospels. In fact, John's Lazarus was a direct refutation of Luke's Lazarus. What the 4 Gospels show us are vastly different Christian communities that grew up knowing different stories about this mythical Jesus that never existed.
So we can see Jesus clearly existed because we have the 4 eyewitness accounts of the Gospels.
Okay, so let's go line by line with this. If the 4 Gospels are your evidence that Jesus existed, then you don't have any evidence that Jesus existed. All of them are either based on scripture or they're based on previous Gospels.
The early Christian confirmation of these Gospels.
Nope, there was no early Christian confirmation of the Gospels. Nobody confirmed anything historically about the faith after the 2nd century. It was just, they took it at its word. If it said it in scripture and the scripture confirms the New Testament, then it was taken as true.
Then we have the writings of the Apostle Paul and the writings of the Apostolic Fathers. And it's because of all of this evidence that Christians can confidently proclaim Jesus certainly existed.
If that is all your evidence for saying that Jesus existed in history, then you have little to no evidence whatsoever. I say little because you could possibly use Paul to prove a historical Jesus, but I think that the arguments for Paul only ever considering Jesus to be celestial to be much stronger than the ones that say that Paul considered Jesus to be historical. But I do concede that there is an argument to be had over Paul. I find Evan's historical evidence for Jesus lacking. Lacking in substance, lacking in truth. It's just lacking all around. It seems to me that all Evan did was read the conservative Christian scholars that are towing the conservative Christian line about Jesus and is just running with. This shows how Christian New Testament scholarship is quite nearly intellectually bankrupt. I'm not going to say that every single Christian scholar is towing this Christian line because their jobs depend on it, but a vast majority of this consensus definitely requires accepting that Jesus was a historical figure and refuses to address the problems with saying that. Evan's video is a perfect example of what's wrong with New Testament scholarship. But I would like to know what y'all think. Let me know down below in the comments if you think that Evan's evidence is good, or if you think that it's lacking like I feel. Let me know down below in the comments. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of mythicist content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.